This poor girl runs to a millionaire and says someone is in the trunk of his car, but when they open the trunk to see what's inside, something shocking happens. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment to support my work. The morning. Sunbathed the supermarket parking lot as Arthur Montgomery adjusted his Italian tie, observing his reflection in the window of his imported car. At 42, his stern face and impeccable suit reflected the successful life he had built, although his grey eyes carried a coldness that kept people at bay. After checking that his leather briefcase was properly closed, he activated the car alarm and began walking toward the supermarket. His thoughts were focused on the meeting he had in a few hours, another legal process involving his company that needed to be resolved. That's when he felt something tug at the sleeve of his jacket. Annoyed by the possibility of his suit being wrinkled, he turned sharply, ready to reprimand whoever it was. A little girl of approximately 6 years old stared at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Her purple polka-dot dress was dirty and crumpled, her disheveled red hair framing a pale face marked by fear. Her small hands trembled as she held tightly to the expensive fabric of his clothes. "He went into the trunk of your car," she said. Her voice choked with suppressed crying. Arthur tried to disentangle himself delicately. He had been through similar situations before, street children trying to get his attention to ask for money or food, but something in the desperation of those eyes made him hesitate. "What are you talking about? Who went into the trunk?" He asked, his voice still maintaining a serious and distant tone. "My brother, yes, please, you have to help," she begged, clinging even more to his arm. Arthur sighed deeply. His meeting was too important to waste time on children's stories. Even so, something about the situation bothered him. Maybe it was better to check quickly, just to be sure. "Okay, let's look," he said, turning back toward the car. The girl followed him closely, her little steps trying to keep up with the businessman's wide strides. When they reached the vehicle, Arthur pressed the button on the remote control, and the trunk opened smoothly. As he expected, it was completely empty. He turned to the girl, ready to scold her for lying, but the look of panic on her face surprised him. No, it was just like yours. The car was just like it," she shouted, looking frantically around the parking lot. "There, the man who took my brother." Arthur followed the direction she was pointing and noticed a man standing between the cars. He was wearing a cap that covered part of his face, and realizing he was being watched, turned quickly and began to walk away. "Please, believe me," the girl pleaded, tears now running freely down her face. He took Tommy, he offered food, and then pushed him into the car. Arthur was about to call the establishment's security when he noticed something strange. The man in the cap had stopped next to a car exactly like his, same model and color. He was standing suspiciously, as if he were watching something. "What's your name?" he asked the girl, without taking his eyes off the suspicious man. "Alice," she replied, sniffling. "And your brother?" "Tommy, he's 8 years old. We're alone since our mom left. She said she'd be back, but—" Alice couldn't finish the sentence, her voice breaking with a sob. Arthur felt something stirring inside him. An old and painful memory that he had buried long ago began to emerge. He shook his head, trying to push those thoughts away. "Stay here," he said, leading Alice inside the supermarket. "I'm going to call security." "No!" She grabbed his arm with surprising force. "There's no time. Tommy, he might hurt Tommy." Arthur observed the despair in the girl's eyes. For the first time, he began to consider that she might be telling the truth. The man's behavior was really suspicious, and there was something about the whole situation that disturbed him deeply. As he was thinking about what to do, he saw the man in the cap get into his car and start the engine. The vehicle began to move slowly toward the exit of the parking lot. "He's leaving!" Alice screamed, her little body trembling with fear. Arthur made a quick decision. He took Alice's hand and led her to his car. "Get in," he ordered, opening the passenger door, "and put on your seatbelt." He went around quickly and got into the driver's side, starting the car instantly. His eyes did not lose sight of the other vehicle, which was now turning right at the exit of the parking lot. "Where is he going?" muttered to himself, keeping a safe distance as he followed the other car. Alice was sitting rigidly beside him, her small hands clenched together. "Do you believe me?" she asked in a low voice. Arthur didn't answer immediately. His rational mind told him he was doing something crazy, following a stranger based only on the word of a street kid. But something deeper, something he had buried a long time ago, kept him from ignoring the situation. The car ahead began to enter less busy streets, following a path that was increasingly moving away from downtown. Arthur kept his distance, his heart beating faster with each turn. "Are you sure you saw your brother being put in a trunk?" Arthur asked Alice, his voice tight. "Yes," she replied, her voice small but firm. "I saw when he pushed Tommy. My brother tried to scream, but the man covered his mouth." Arthur gripped the steering wheel tighter. The story was starting to sound more and more real, and that worried him enormously. If it was true, it meant they were dealing with something much more serious than he initially thought. The car ahead began to slow down, entering a narrow, dimly lit alley. Arthur stopped his vehicle before the entrance, watching carefully. The other car parked at the back of the alley, partially hidden by a dumpster. "Stay in here," he told Alice, unlocking her seatbelt. "Don't get out of the car for anything, understand?" Alice nodded, her wide eyes fixed on the car parked in the distance. Arthur got out silently, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached cautiously, he saw the man in the cap get out of the vehicle and look around nervously. He took a phone from his pocket and began to speak in a low voice. Arthur moved closer, trying not to make any noise. That's when he noticed. The trunk of the car was slightly ajar. Arthur felt his heart leap when he saw the trunk ajar. At that moment, all his doubts about Alice's story dissipated. The man continued talking on the phone, completely unaware of his presence. With silent steps, Arthur moved closer, trying to overhear the conversation. "I already got the kid. Yes, the way you asked," the man muttered, his voice tense and nervous. "But his sister escaped. No, I couldn't get her too." Arthur felt a wave of nausea as he confirmed that Alice was telling the truth. The man paused the conversation, put the cell phone in his pocket, and began walking towards the trunk. That's when Arthur decided to act. "Hey!" he shouted, stepping out of his hiding place. The man turned sharply, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment he stood paralyzed, but soon recovered and tried to run. Arthur, moved by a force he didn't know he possessed, managed to catch him. The two men grappled, falling on the dirty floor of the alley. The attacker was strong and managed to land a punch on Arthur's face, who felt the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. But something inside him, a fierce determination that came from a deep and forgotten place, kept him from giving up. He managed to immobilize the man, pressing him against the ground. "Help! Is anyone there?" Arthur shouted, hoping that some resident of the area would hear. The man kept struggling, trying to break free. That's when Arthur heard a noise coming. From the trunk, a weak, muffled groan. Tommy was in there, and by the sound, he was still alive. This gave him even more strength to keep the attacker pinned down. Some residents began to appear, attracted by the shouts. An elderly lady, seeing the scene, quickly took out her cell phone and called the police. Other men came forward to help Arthur restrain the criminal. "Can someone check the trunk?" Arthur asked, panting. "There's a child in there." One of the residents ran to the car and fully opened the trunk. What he saw made him recoil in horror. Tommy was there, unconscious, his face pale and sweaty. There were marks of ropes on his wrists and ankles. "My God, he's not breathing right," shouted the man. At that moment, Arthur heard a scream that chilled his blood. Alice, disobeying his orders, had gotten out of the car and was now running towards her brother. "Tommy! Tommy!" she shouted, tears streaming down her dirty face. Arthur wanted to go to them, but he couldn't let go of the attacker, who was still trying to break free. Fortunately, police sirens began to sound, approaching quickly. "Someone needs to check his vitals!" Arthur shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. A woman approached Tommy and checked his pulse. "It's weak, but he's alive," she said. "It looks like he was drugged with something." When the police finally arrived, everything happened very fast. The attacker was handcuffed and placed in the patrol car, while the paramedics rushed to attend to Tommy. The boy was placed on a stretcher, various devices being connected to his fragile body. Alice refused to leave her brother's side, clinging to the stretcher as the paramedics tried to work. Arthur, after giving his initial statement to the police officers, approached her gently. "Alice!" he called, his voice softer than it had ever been. "We need to let the doctors take care of Tommy now." The girl turned to him, her eyes red from crying so much. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked in a trembling voice. "We're going to do everything we can," Arthur replied, surprising himself with the sincerity of his own words. "But now we need to let the doctors do their job." With great difficulty, he managed to convince Alice to release the stretcher. The girl immediately clung to him, burying her face in his now dirty and wrinkled suit. Arthur tensed for a moment, unaccustomed to physical contact, but something in that child's desperation made him relax. Awkwardly, he placed a hand on her back, trying to offer some comfort. The paramedics reported that they would take Tommy to St. Jude's Hospital, the closest one. Arthur didn't hesitate to say that he would accompany them. As he followed the ambulance in his car, with Alice silent in the passenger seat, his mind was in turmoil. What had happened to these children's mother? Why were they alone? And why had that man tried to kidnap Tommy? So many unanswered questions. And now he was involved in something that went far beyond his organized and solitary life. At the hospital, Tommy was taken immediately to the emergency room. Arthur had to fill out a series of forms, improvising information that Alice was able to provide between sobs. The girl didn't know much, only that her mother had left 2 days ago, promising to return soon, and never appeared again. "She always does this," explained Alice, sitting in one of the hard chairs in the waiting room. But before she came back, on the same day, this time she didn't come back. Arthur felt something tighten in his chest. "And you don't have other relatives, someone who can take care of you?" Alice shook her head negatively. "Just us, me and Tommy. We always took care of each other." The following hours were tense. The doctors went in and out of the emergency room, but no one gave concrete news. Alice ended up falling asleep, exhausted, her head resting on Arthur's arm. He watched her tear-stained face, so young and already carrying so much suffering. It was then that one of the doctors finally appeared with news. Tommy had been drugged with a strong substance, probably to keep him quiet during the kidnapping. His condition was serious but stable. He would need to stay in the hospital for a few days for detoxification. If he hadn't been found in time, the doctor left the sentence in the air, his serious look saying everything that needed to be said. Arthur felt a shiver run down his spine. If he hadn't believed Alice, if he had ignored his instincts, Tommy could be dead now. A social worker arrived shortly after, wanting to know more about the children's situation. Arthur explained what he knew, his stomach churning, when the woman mentioned that the children would probably have to be referred to a foster care as soon as Tommy was discharged. "No," cried Alice, who had woken up and heard the conversation. "I don't want to go to foster care. I want to stay with my brother." The social worker tried to calm the girl, explaining that it was standard procedure, but Alice was inconsolable. Arthur watched the scene, feeling increasingly restless. Something inside him refused to accept that these children would be separated and thrown into the system. "There must be another solution," he said, surprising himself. The social worker looked at him curiously. "Are you related to the children?" she asked. "No, but—" Arthur hesitated. What was he about to say? That he wanted to take responsibility for two children he barely knew? It was crazy. His life was too complicated, his routine too rigid. There was no room for children in his world. But then Alice looked at him, her eyes full of hope and fear, and something inside him broke. An old memory, too painful to be revisited, began to emerge in his mind. "But," encouraged the social worker, Arthur took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change his life forever. "But maybe I can help," he said finally. Arthur's words hung in the air of the waiting room for a few seconds. The social worker watched him with a mixture of surprise and suspicion, while Alice held her breath, her little fingers squeezing the hem of her dirty t-shirt. "Mr. Montgomery," began the social worker, consulting her notes, "I understand your concern, but it's not that simple. There are procedures, evaluations, a whole legal process that needs to be followed." Arthur adjusted his tie, an automatic gesture he made when he was nervous. His suit, once impeccable, was now wrinkled and dirty from the fight. "I understand perfectly," he replied, his voice regaining the professional tone he usually used in meetings. "I'm a lawyer. I know the legal procedures. I'm willing to go through the entire necessary process." The social worker, who introduced herself as Susan, frowned, making more notes. "Do you have experience with children? Any children of your own?" "No," Arthur admitted. "I live alone. But I can offer them everything they need, a safe home, quality education, medical care." "It's not just a financial matter," Susan interrupted. "These children have been through a severe trauma. They need emotional stability, full attention. How many hours a day do you work?" Arthur felt the weight of that question. It was true. His life was dedicated to work. He woke up before sunrise and often came home late at night. How could he take care of two children? "I can reorganize my routine," he said, although he didn't know exactly how he would do it. "I can hire people to help reduce my hours at the office." "Please," Alice's voice interrupted the conversation. She looked at Susan with pleading eyes. "Let us stay with him. He saved Tommy. He believed in me when nobody else would." Susan sighed, looking from Alice to Arthur. "I'm going to need to make a home visit, evaluate your living conditions, and we'll have to locate the children's mother to formalize any decision." At that moment, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Montgomery? The boy is awake. He's asking for his sister." Alice jumped out of her chair immediately, but Susan stopped her. "Wait, we need to see if he's in a condition to receive visitors." "He needs me," Alice protested, tears beginning to form again in her eyes. "Please let me see my brother." Arthur approached Susan. "I can accompany her. I promise we won't disturb him." After a few moments of hesitation, Susan agreed. The three followed the nurse to the room where Tommy was hospitalized. Arthur's heart tightened as he saw the boy, so small and fragile in that hospital bed, surrounded by devices and with an oxygen mask covering part of his face. "Tommy!" Alice ran to the bed, holding her brother's hand carefully. The boy opened his eyes slowly, looking disoriented. "Alice!" His voice was hoarse, almost inaudible. Where am I?" "In the hospital," Alice replied, trying to smile through her tears. "You're going to be okay now. The man over there saved you." Tommy looked in the direction of Arthur, who remained standing near the door, not knowing exactly how to act. The boy tried to say something, but began to cough. A nurse entered quickly, adjusting something on one of the devices. "I think it's best to let him rest now," she said gently. "He's still very weak." "I don't want to go," Alice protested, clinging to the bedrail. "I don't want to leave him alone." Arthur approached, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "He needs to rest to get strong, Alice. We can come back later." "Promise?" she asked, looking at him with those eyes that seemed to see through his soul. "I promise," he replied, surprised by the firmness of his own voice. When they left the room, Susan was waiting for them in the hallway. "I need to make some calls," she said. "For now, Alice can be under your temporary supervision, Mr. Montgomery. But this is only provisional, understood?" Arthur nodded. Susan continued, "I'm going to need your documents, proof of residence, and we'll need to schedule that home visit as soon as possible." As Susan walked away to make her calls, Arthur found himself alone with Alice in the hospital hallway. Girl seemed exhausted, her legs trembling slightly. "You must be hungry," he said, realizing that it was already past lunchtime. In fact, it was already getting dark. The whole day had passed in that confusion. Alice just nodded, looking too small in her dirty and worn clothes. Arthur looked at her, really looked, for the first time. Her red hair was tangled, the purple dress had stains and small tears. Her shoes were worn, one of them with a hole in the sole. "Let's get something to eat," he decided, "and then we need to buy some things for you." Woo. On the way to the hospital cafeteria, Arthur made a few calls, first to his office, cancelling all appointments for the next few days, then to his housekeeper, asking her to prepare one of the guest rooms. Finally, he called his personal assistant, requesting her to buy clothes and basic items for a 6-year-old girl. While Alice ate her sandwich in silence, Arthur watched her, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What was he doing? How could he take care of 2 children? He, who could barely maintain relationships with other adults, who lived isolated in his mansion, focused only on work. But then Alice looked up, offering him a small smile, the first he had seen on her face since that whole story began. And at that moment, something inside him transformed, an inexplicable certainty that however difficult it might be, he was doing the right thing. "Thank you," she said softly, wiping her mouth with the napkin. "Are you really going to let us stay with you?" Arthur felt a lump in his throat. "I'm going to try," he replied honestly, "but it's not going to be easy. There's a lot that needs to be resolved first." "We promise to behave," she said quickly. "I know how to cook a little. I can help clean the house. Tommy too, when he gets better. We won't be any trouble, I swear." Arthur's heart tightened when he heard those words. A 6-year-old shouldn't worry about cooking or cleaning. She shouldn't have to prove her worth through housework. "Alice," he said, leaning forward, when you and your brother come to live with me, the only thing I want you and your brother to do is be kids. Understand?" She looked at him confused, as if that concept was strange to her. Before they could continue the conversation, Susan reappeared. "Mr. Montgomery, we need to talk," she said, her tone serious. "In private." Arthur looked at Alice, who immediately tensed. "It's okay," he assured her. "Stay here finishing your snack. I'll be right back." Susan led him to a more secluded corner of the cafeteria. Her face was grave. "We managed to locate the children's mother," she said, "and the situation is more complicated than we imagined." Arthur felt his stomach churn with Susan's words. He glanced quickly at Alice, who was still sitting at the cafeteria table, her little feet swinging without reaching the ground. "What did you find out?" he asked, turning his attention back to the social worker. Susan consulted her notes. "Helen Martinez, 32 years old. She has an extensive history of drug problems and previous abandonments. The children have been through similar situations before, but she always came back after a few days." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the anger that was starting to grow inside him. "Where is she now?" "She was found at a rehab clinic," Susan replied. "Apparently, after abandoning the children, she had an overdose and was hospitalized. She's conscious now, but—" Susan paused, hesitant. "She didn't show much interest when we mentioned what happened to her son." "What do you mean?" Arthur's voice came out louder than he intended, causing some people to look in their direction. "She said that the children always managed well, on their own, and that it wasn't a big deal. Susan shook her head, clearly disturbed. When we informed her about the attempted kidnapping, she just shrugged and said that these things happen. Arthur felt his blood boil in his veins. How could a mother be so indifferent to the suffering of her own children? His fists clenched, involuntarily. "There's more," Susan continued. "She said that if someone wants to stay with the children, that's fine with her. In her words, it would even be a relief." The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur looked again at Alice, who was now playing distractedly with the crumbs from her sandwich. How do you explain to a child that her own mother doesn't want her? "Does this make the guardianship process easier?" he asked finally. "In theory, yes," Susan replied, "but it also complicates it in other ways. Ms. Martinez has a history of doing this, abandoning the children, allowing other people to temporarily assume custody, only to reappear later demanding money or favors." Arthur frowned. "She blackmails people? It's happened before," Susan confirmed. "One family even started the adoption process 2 years ago, but Helen appeared making threats and demanding money. The family gave up, and the children went back to her." "That's not going to happen this time," Arthur said, his voice firm. "I have the resources to hire the best lawyers to ensure that she can never hurt them again." Susan watched him for a moment. "Mr. Montgomery, I need to ask, why are you doing this? You didn't know these children until this morning. Why get involved in something so complicated?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. His gaze wandered around the room until it fixed on a distant point, as if he were seeing something that wasn't really there. "When I was 10 years old," he began, his voice low and controlled, "my younger brother, Michael, disappeared. We were coming back from school. I was supposed to be looking after him, but I got distracted talking to some friends. When I realized it, he wasn't there anymore." Susan listened in silence, realizing that this story was rarely told. "We searched for days," Arthur continued. "The police, my parents, the whole neighborhood, but we never found him. We never found out what happened to him." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I've spent the last 30 years blaming myself for not paying more attention, for not protecting my little brother." "I'm sorry," Susan said softly. "When I saw Alice today, desperate to save her brother," Arthur shook his head, "I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend it wasn't my business. And now," he looked at the girl again, "now I can't abandon them." Susan nodded slowly, making more notes on her clipboard. "I understand, but I need you to understand too. If we're going to go through with this, there will have to be significant changes in your life. It can't just be an emotional reaction to your own trauma." "I'm aware of that," Arthur replied, "and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." At that moment, a nurse appeared in a hurry. "Mr. Montgomery? The boy is having a crisis. He won't stop calling for his sister." Arthur and Susan rushed to Tommy's room, with Alice close behind them. The boy was agitated in bed, trying to tear off the tubes and wires connected to his body. "Alice! Where's Alice?" he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. "I'm here, Tommy!" Alice ran to the bed, holding her brother's hand. "Calm down. I'm here." Gradually, Tommy calmed down with his sister's presence. The doctors took the opportunity to adjust his medication, explaining that he was having flashbacks of the kidnapping. "That man," Tommy murmured, clinging to Alice's hand. "He said he was going to take me away, that I'd never see Alice again." "It's okay now," Alice assured him. "The man over there saved you. He didn't let the bad man hurt you." Tommy looked at Arthur, who remained a little distant. "Thank you," said the boy, his voice weak but sincere. Arthur approached the bed, feeling something strange in his chest, a mixture of protection and fear that he hadn't felt since he was a child, since the times with Michael. "Rest now," he said gently. "Your sister will stay here with you." "Promise you won't leave?" Tommy asked, his eyes already heavy with sleep. "I promise," Arthur replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice as he watched the two children, Tommy gradually falling asleep and Alice watching over his sleep. Arthur felt something change inside him, a decision solidifying, a certainty forming. No matter what he had to face, he wouldn't abandon these children. Susan approached him silently. "I'm going to prepare the initial papers," she said. "But I need to warn you, their mother, even being at the clinic, still has legal rights. And knowing her history, she'll probably try to interfere when she finds out there's money involved." "Let her try," Arthur replied, his voice carrying a determination he hadn't felt in years. This time, these children are not going back to someone who doesn't love them. What Arthur didn't know, as he made this silent promise, was that his battle was just beginning. Helen Martinez was more dangerous than anyone could imagine, and she wouldn't give up on her children, or rather, what she could gain through them, without a fight. The following days were a whirlwind in Arthur's life. While Tommy slowly recovered in the hospital, he needed to completely reorganize his routine to care for Alice and begin the process of gaining custody of the children. His mansion, once silent and organized, was now being adapted to receive its new residents. Mary, his housekeeper for 15 years, watched with a mixture of surprise and satisfaction as he personally supervised the decoration of the children's rooms. For the first time in all those years, she saw her boss truly involved in something beyond work. "Are you sure about the colors?" she asked, seeing Arthur analyze different shades of blue for Tommy's room. "Alice said it's his favorite color," he replied, comparing two samples. "I want them to feel at home." Mary smiled discreetly. In a few days, she had witnessed a remarkable transformation in Arthur. The cold and distant man was, little by little, giving way to someone more accessible, more human. At the hospital, Tommy continued to have nightmares. The doctors explained that it was normal, considering the trauma he had suffered. Alice refused to leave her brother's side, sleeping in an uncomfortable armchair next to the bed. "You need to rest properly," Arthur said to her one afternoon, seeing her deep, dark circles. "I promise to bring you to see your brother every day, but you need to sleep in a real bed." Alice hesitated, biting her lower lip. "What if he has a nightmare again? What if he needs me? The nurses are always around," Arthur assured her. "And look, I bought this for you." He took 2 simple cell phones from his pocket, the kind made for children. "This is yours, and this is Tommy's, so you can talk to each other whenever you want." Alice's eyes widened. "Really, for us?" "Yes," he replied, showing her how to use it. "I've already recorded my number and the hospital's. When Tommy's stronger, you can teach him how to use it too." The girl held the device as if it were something precious, but soon her expression changed. "What if Mom comes back and takes it from us?" Arthur's heart tightened. It was the first time Alice had mentioned her mother since everything happened. "That's not going to happen," he assured her, his voice firm. "I promise I'll protect you." That night, after much insistence, he managed to take Alice home. The girl was amazed by the room that had been prepared for her. Walls in soft shades of pink, her favorite color, as he had discovered. A large bed with a canopy, and a bookshelf full of children's books. "Is it all mine?" she asked, touching the soft sheets delicately. "All yours," Arthur confirmed, "and we're still going to buy more things you need." Alice continued to explore the room in silence, stopping before each detail as if she didn't believe what she was seeing. When she reached the closet and found several new clothes, all in her size, her eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing all this for us?" she asked finally, her voice small. Arthur knelt down to be at her level. Because all children deserve to have a safe home, clean clothes, food on the table. Because you and your brother are special and deserve to be cared for and protected. But Mom always said we were just a nuisance, Alice murmured, lowering her eyes, that nobody would want to stay with us. Arthur felt a wave of anger run through his body, but he kept his voice calm. Your mother was wrong, Alice, very wrong. That same night, while Alice was finally sleeping in her new bed, Arthur received a call from Susan. Her tone was urgent. Helen Martinez escaped from the clinic, she said bluntly, and she's making threats. Arthur felt his blood run cold. What kind of threats? She found out you're rich, Susan explained. She's saying she's going to fight for custody of the children, that she's going to go to the media, that she's going to expose your secrets. What secrets? Arthur interrupted. She doesn't even know me. It doesn't matter, Susan replied. She's manipulative. She'll make up stories, create problems. She's done this before with other families who tried to help the children. Arthur ran his hand through his hair, trying to stay calm. What can we do? For now, reinforce security, Susan advised. I'm going to speed up the process of temporary custody, but I need you to understand, this is going to get ugly before it gets better. After hanging up, Arthur made several calls. First to his security team, reinforcing the surveillance of the mansion, then to the hospital, ensuring that no one other than him and the medical staff had access to Tommy. Finally, to his trusted lawyer. Little did he know that at that very moment, Helen Martinez was in a roadside bar, talking to questionable people, making plans that would put everyone in danger. The next morning, Arthur took Alice to see her brother, as promised. Tommy was stronger. He could already sit in bed and eat alone. His eyes lit up when he saw his sister wearing new clothes and with her hair neatly combed. You look different. Alice, he exclaimed. Arthur bought a lot of clothes for us, she said excitedly. And your room is already ready too, all blue the way you like it. Tommy looked at Arthur, who remained a little distant as always. Really? Really, Arthur confirmed, approaching. As soon as the doctors discharge you, you'll be able to see it. The boy was silent for a moment, playing with the hem of the sheet. What about Mom? He asked finally. Is she going to let us live with you? Arthur exchanged a quick glance with Alice, who had tensed at the mention of her mother. Don't worry about that now, he said softly. We're going to resolve everything in the best possible way. But as soon as they left the room, a nurse called him discreetly. Mr. Montgomery, earlier today a woman tried to come in to see the boy. When we asked for identification, she became aggressive and started shouting that she was his mother. Arthur felt his heart race. And what happened? Security escorted her out, the nurse replied. But she threatened to come back with the police and lawyers. She said she's going to sue the hospital. As they drove home, Arthur kept an eye on the rearview mirror, watching for any car that might be following. Alice, in the back seat, was quiet, hugging a new doll he had bought. Are you okay? He asked, noticing her silence. Is Mom going to hurt us again? She asked in a low voice. Arthur gripped the steering wheel tighter. No, Alice, I won't let her. I promise. But when they arrived home, Mary was waiting for them, with a worried expression. Sir, there's a woman making a scene at the gate. She's threatening to call the press, saying that you kidnapped her children. Arthur felt Alice cling to his leg, trembling. Outside, he could hear Helen Martinez's screams echoing through the quiet street. Arthur reacted quickly to the situation. He picked up Alice, feeling her little body tremble, and handed her into Mary's care. Take her to the back room, he instructed in a low voice. Stay with her and don't open the door to anyone. Mary nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. As she walked away with Alice, the girl looked over the housekeeper's shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. Helen's screams grew louder. I know my daughter's in there. You can't stop me from seeing my children. I'm going to call the police. I'm going to call the press. Everyone's going to know what you've done. Arthur took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and walked to the gate. Helen was there, leaning on the bars, her face marked by drug use, her eyes bloodshot and disoriented. She was wearing dirty and crumpled clothes, and her hair, the same red color as Alice's, was disheveled. "Ms. Martinez," he said, keeping his voice controlled, "I suggest you calm down." "Calm down," she laughed, a harsh and humorless sound. "You steal my children and you want me to calm down? Who do you think you are?" "I didn't steal anyone," Arthur replied, still calm. "I saved your son from a kidnapper while you were unconscious in a rehab clinic. Your children were alone, starving. And you think you're so noble, don't you?" Helen clung tighter to the bars. "The rich guy who decided to play the hero. But I know what you want. People like you always want something." Arthur noticed that some neighbors were starting to appear in their windows, attracted by the commotion. He needed to resolve the situation quickly. "Ms. Martinez, all your accusations are false, and you know it. I suggest you seek professional help, and when you are in a condition, we can talk civilly about the welfare of the children." "Welfare?" She spat out the words. "Who are you to talk about welfare? You know what? I've already called the police. And you know what else? I have a journalist friend. He'll love to know how the powerful Arthur Montgomery kidnapped the children of a poor single mother." At that moment, a car pulled up in the street. Susan, the social worker, got out hastily, followed by 2 police officers. "Helen," Susan called, approaching cautiously, "we need to talk." "I have nothing to talk about with you," Helen shouted. "You're all against me, but I'll show you. I'll show everyone." She reached into her battered bag and took out something that made Arthur freeze, a brown envelope. "You know what's in here?" She brandished the envelope in the air. "Evidence! Evidence that you're not as perfect as you seem." Arthur frowned, confused. What evidence could she have? "Helen," Susan tried again, "you're agitated. Let's talk in a calmer place." "Agitated?" Helen laughed again, that same chilling laugh. "You haven't seen anything yet. Hey, Montgomery, do you want everyone to know about your little brother, about how you let him disappear?" Arthur felt like he had been punched in the stomach. How did she know about Michael? "It wasn't hard to find out," Helen continued, seeing his reaction. "There are a lot of people willing to talk, you know, especially when you offer the right incentive." The police officers began to approach, but Helen didn't seem to notice. She was completely focused on Arthur. What kind of person lets their own brother disappear? And now you want to take care of my children? Ha! I bet the newspapers will love that story. "Enough!" Susan's voice cut through the air. "Helen, you are violating several conditions of your parole. Threats, harassment, abandonment of treatment." "I don't care," Helen shouted. "These are my children, mine, and if I can't have them—" She reached into her bag again. The police officers reacted immediately, advancing towards her. In the confusion that followed, the envelope fell to the ground, its contents scattering across the sidewalk. Dozens of old newspaper clippings, all about the disappearance of Michael. Arthur watched the scene as if he were in a nightmare. Those headlines, those photos. It had been so long since he had seen them, so long since he tried not to think about it. "Mr. Montgomery," the voice of Susan brought him back to reality. Helen was being placed in the police car, still shouting threats. "This isn't over. You'll see. Everyone will know. Everyone." Susan bent down to pick up the papers from the ground. "I'm so sorry about this," she said, handing the envelope to Arthur. "She must have done some research, found these old news stories." Arthur held the envelope as if it were something explosive. "How did she find out?" "Helen is manipulative," Susan explained. "She probably got someone to research your past. She does this, tries to find weak spots to use against people." At that moment, Mary appeared at the door of the house. Her face was pale. "Sir, the girl..." Arthur felt his heart tighten. "What happened?" "She heard everything," Mary replied, wringing her hands nervously. "Through the bedroom window. She's very scared. She doesn't want to talk to anyone." "Arthur, ran up the stairs, two at a time. He found Alice curled up in a corner of the room, hugging her knees, her little body trembling. "Alice," he called softly. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. "What Mom said about your brother?" Arthur felt his heart break. He approached slowly and sat on the floor near her, but giving her enough space so she wouldn't feel pressured. "Yes," he replied after a moment. "It's true, I had a younger brother, Michael, and he disappeared when we were children." Alice raised her head, her eyes red from crying so much. "Is that why you helped us? Because of your brother?" Arthur thought for a moment before answering. Maybe in the beginning, yes. When I saw you desperate to save your brother, I remembered how I felt when I lost Michael. But now..." He paused, searching for the right words. "Now I want to help you, because I care. Because you and Tommy deserve a better life." Alice watched him for a long moment, as if she were evaluating his sincerity. "Is Mum coming back?" she asked finally. "I don't know," Arthur answered honestly, "but I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you and your brother. Even if Mom tells bad things about you." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. "Even then, I won't abandon you, Alice, never." Slowly, very slowly, Alice approached him. When she was close enough, she reached out and touched his face gently. "You're crying," she said, surprised. Arthur hadn't even noticed the tears streaming down his face. How many years had it been since the last time he had cried? Since he had allowed someone to see him vulnerable? "Sometimes," he said, his voice hoarse, "adults also cry. Especially when they remember sad things, or when they are worried about people they love." Alice came closer and, to his surprise, hugged him. "Don't be sad," she whispered. "We can be your family now." Arthur hugged her back, feeling something inside him, something that had been frozen for so long, begin to melt. The morning after the incident with Helen, Arthur woke up earlier than usual. He had spent the night sleepless, tossing and turning in bed, his mind a whirlwind of worries. The envelope with the old news stories about Michael remained untouched on his desk, a silent but disturbing presence. He went down for coffee and found Mary already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The housekeeper looked at him with obvious concern in her eyes. "You haven't slept at all, have you?" she asked, serving a cup of strong coffee. Arthur just shook his head, sitting heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. It was strange to be there. He usually ate his meals in the formal dining room when he remembered to eat. "The girl didn't sleep well either," Mary continued. "I heard her walking around the room several times during the night." Before Arthur could respond, the phone rang. It was from the hospital. Tommy had had a difficult night, with intense nightmares. The doctors suggested that it would be good if someone from the family could spend more time with him. "I'm going to wake up Alice," Arthur said, getting up. "Let me go," Mary interrupted gently. "You need to prepare for the meeting with the lawyers." Arthur had almost forgotten. His legal team was coming that morning to discuss the custody process. He went upstairs to change, trying to bring order to his thoughts. When he came down again, he found Alice in the living room, already dressed and combed, but with deep, dark circles under her eyes. She was playing distractedly with the hem of her new dress. "Good morning," he said softly. "Did you sleep well?" Alice shook her head. "I had bad dreams," she admitted in a low voice. "With Mom?" Arthur sat down next to her on the couch. "Do you want to talk about it?" The girl hesitated for a moment. She was screaming like yesterday, but in the dream she managed to get into the house and... Her voice trailed off. "And," Arthur prompted gently. "And she took us away," Alice completed, tears starting to form in her eyes. Like the other times, Arthur felt his heart tighten. "Other times?" Alice nodded, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her dress. There was a family before. They were nice too. They wanted to stay with us. But then Mom showed up and did a lot of bad things until they gave up. Arthur was about to respond when the doorbell rang. His lawyers had arrived. "Are we going to visit your brother?" he asked, trying to distract Alice. "After I finish this meeting?" The girl's face lit up a little. "Promise?" "I promise." The meeting with the lawyers was tense. The news wasn't good. Helen had really contacted the press, and some tabloid magazines were already preparing articles about the case. "She's painting a very negative picture, Mr. Montgomery," explained Dr. Richards, his lead attorney. "She's using the disappearance of your brother to question your ability to care for children." "That's ridiculous," Arthur exclaimed, slamming his hand on the table. "I was a child when that happened." "We know that," Dr. Pauline, another lawyer on the team, interjected, "but public impression is important in custody cases, and Helen is playing dirty. She's insinuating that there's a pattern of missing children. In your life?" Arthur felt his blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "She's spreading the theory that you have some kind of morbid obsession," explained Dr. Richards, clearly uncomfortable. "That because of the trauma with your brother, you're trying to steal her children to fill that void." "That's absurd!" Arthur stood up, starting to pace the room. "I saved those children. Tommy almost died. And that's what we're going to, focus on," said Dr. Pauline. "We have concrete evidence of abandonment, kidnapping, Helen's negligence. We have medical reports, witnesses, the social worker's testimony. But we need to act fast," added Dr. Richards. "Helen is unstable, and unstable people are unpredictable. We need to get definitive custody before she does something even worse." At that moment, they heard a noise coming from the hallway. Arthur opened the door and found Alice sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, trembling. "Did you hear everything?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Alice nodded without raising her head. "Mom is going to succeed, isn't she? She always manages to ruin everything." Arthur picked her up in his arms, ignoring the lawyers who were watching the scene. "Not this time, Alice. This time it's going to be different." "How do you know?" she asked, her voice small and scared. "Because this time you're not alone," he replied firmly, "and I promise I won't give up, no matter what your mother tries to do." Later, at the hospital, they found Tommy more dejected than usual. The boy barely touched the lunch that the nurse brought, and his eyes were red and swollen. "What's wrong?" asked Alice, sitting on the edge of her brother's bed. "Is something hurting?" Tommy shook his head. "Mom came here again," he said quietly. Arthur felt his blood boil. "What do you mean? I thought they had reinforced security." "She didn't come in," Tommy explained. "She was yelling outside. I heard her saying that we were going back to her, that no one would want to stay with us anyway." Alice held her brother's hand tightly. "It's not true. Arthur wants us. He promised." Tommy looked at Arthur with eyes full of doubt and fear. "Really?" Arthur approached the bed, sitting on the other side. "Absolutely true. And you know why? Because you are incredible, brave, and special children. Because you deserve to be loved and protected. Even if we are trouble," Tommy asked hesitantly. "You're not trouble," Arthur replied firmly. "You are children. Children need care, attention, love. That's not trouble. It's what every child deserves to have." At that moment, Susan appeared in the doorway. Her face was serious. "Mr. Montgomery, we need to talk, in private." Arthur looked at the children, hesitant to leave them. "You can go," said Alice. "I'll take care of Tommy." In the hallway, Susan didn't waste time with pleasantries. Helen got a lawyer, someone important, one of those who love controversial cases. They filed for emergency custody. Arthur felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. How did she get a lawyer of that level? She has no money. "Apparently," Susan replied, "someone is financing it. Someone who has an interest in hurting you." "Who?" "We don't know yet, but whoever it is knows your past very well." They are using everything, the disappearance of Michael, your reclusive life, even your excessive work, to try to prove that you are not fit to raise the children. Arthur leaned against the wall, suddenly feeling exhausted. What can we do? For now, keep the children safe and... Susan hesitated. Maybe it's time to face your own ghosts, Mr. Montgomery, because they are being used against you. Arthur spent the night sleepless, Susan's words echoing in his mind. Facing his own ghosts. It was easier said than done. For 30 years, he had strived to bury the memories of that fateful afternoon when Michael disappeared. He had convinced himself that if he didn't think about it, the pain would lessen. But now, sitting in his office in the early hours of the morning, the envelope with the old news stories seemed to call to him. With trembling hands, he finally opened it. The first headline hit him like a punch. 8-year-old boy disappears on the way home. Older brother was responsible for picking him up from school. The photos were even worse. Michael smiling in his school uniform, his parents devastated during the searches, himself, only 10 years old, being interviewed by the police. Tears that he had long not allowed to roll began to stream down his face as he read the details he had tried to forget. How he had been distracted talking to friends, how it took almost half an hour to realize that Michael was no longer there, how he ran through the streets shouting his brother's name until his voice failed. "Sir?" Mary's voice brought him back to the present. The housekeeper was standing at the door, her face worried. "It's time for coffee, and the girl is already awake." Arthur quickly wiped his face. "I'll be right there." "There's one more thing," Mary continued, hesitant. "This came for you." She handed him a brown envelope with no return address. Inside, there was only a handwritten note. "I know what really happened to your brother. Meet me today at 3 p.m. at the coffee shop on the corner of the hospital. Come alone." Arthur's first impulse was to crumple the note and ignore that obvious provocation. But something made him keep the paper in his pocket. During all those years, they had never discovered what really happened to Michael. The case remained an unsolved mystery. At breakfast, he found Alice more animated than usual. "The doctor said that Tommy can go home tomorrow," she announced between spoonfuls of cereal. Arthur forced a smile, trying to push away his worries. "That's great. We'll have to prepare everything to welcome him. I've already arranged his whole room," Alice said proudly. "Mary helped me fold the new clothes and organize the toys." Observing the girl's enthusiasm, Arthur felt his heart tighten. How could he protect her if he couldn't even face his own fears? The morning passed quickly between meetings with lawyers and preparations for Tommy's return. When it was 2:30 p.m., Arthur was restless. Should he go to the meeting indicated in the note? "I'm going to visit your brother," he said to Alice. "Do you want to come along?" To his surprise, the girl shook her head. "I want to finish arranging things for Tommy. You can go. Mary is helping me." On the way to the hospital, Arthur felt his heart beat faster and faster. The coffee shop indicated in the note was small and discreet, half hidden on a side street. He arrived a few minutes before the scheduled time and chose a table in the back from where he could observe the entrance. Promptly at 3 p.m., a woman entered. She must have been about 60 years old, grey hair tied in a severe bun. Her eyes scanned the room until they found Arthur. Without hesitating, she walked to his table and sat down. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "I'm Carol Oliveira. I was your brother Michael's teacher." Arthur felt his throat dry. "Why are you doing this now, after so long?" "Because I saw your name in the newspapers," she replied. "I saw what that woman is saying about you, using Michael's tragedy to try to take those children away from you. And I can't keep this secret anymore." "What secret?" Arthur leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper. Carol took a time-worn yellow envelope from her bag. "On the day Michael disappeared, he had sought me out before classes. He was scared, He said he needed to tell me something important, but he asked me not to tell anyone, especially his parents. Arthur felt his heart pound in his chest. What did he say? That there was a man following him, someone who stood in front of the school, offered sweets, said he knew his parents. Carol paused, her hands trembling slightly. I should have alerted someone. But he made me promise to keep it a secret. Said he didn't want to worry his family. I was young, inexperienced. I thought it was a child's imagination. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. It was exactly as it had happened with Tommy, a stranger offering food, gaining the child's trust. Why didn't you tell this to the police when he disappeared? I tried, Carol replied, tears starting to form in her eyes. But when I went to the police station, they said it was too late. That without a precise description of the man, without concrete evidence, it was just another unfounded story. And I felt so guilty that I walked away. I asked for a transfer to another school. I tried to forget. And why are you telling me this now? Because I saw the story of that boy, Tommy. The pattern is the same. A man offering food, gaining trust little by little. When I read about how you saved him, how you are fighting to protect those children, she wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. I realized I needed to tell you. You need to know it wasn't your fault, Arthur. You were just a child, too. Arthur felt something break inside him. A wall he had built over 3 decades, a weight he had carried since he was 10 years old. There's one more thing, Carol continued, opening the envelope. Michael made this drawing in art class on the day he disappeared. I kept it all these years. It was a simple drawing, made with crayons. 2 boys holding hands, one bigger and one smaller. Underneath, in Michael's childish handwriting, was written, "Me and my brother Arthur. He always protects me." Arthur could no longer hold back the tears. All the love and trust that his brother had in him were immortalized on that piece of paper. And he had spent 30 years blaming himself, isolating himself, afraid to get close to anyone. When I saw how you saved that boy, Carol said softly, I realized that Michael was right. You have always been a protector, and now you have the chance to do for those children what you couldn't do for your brother. At that moment, Arthur's phone rang. It was Mary, her voice in a panic. "Sir, come back quickly. Helen is here with a lawyer and court officers. They have a warrant. They want to take Alice." Arthur felt the world spin around him. He stood up so abruptly that he knocked the cup of coffee over the table. "I need to go," he said to Carol, his hands trembling as he tried to grab his car keys. "They can't take her, they can't—" "I'll go with you," Carol said, getting up too. "I can be a witness to your character, to how protective you have always been with your brother." In the car, Arthur drove as fast as he could within the limits of the law, while frantically calling his lawyers. Dr. Richards answered on the first ring. "I'm already on my way to your house," the lawyer said. "But Helen got a temporary restraining order. She claimed that you are preventing her contact with the children, that you are alienating them against her." "That's absurd!" Arthur exclaimed, swerving to avoid a slow-moving car. "She tried to break into the hospital. She made a scene at the door of my house." "I know, but the judge who signed the order was not aware of all the facts. We are trying to reverse it, but for now, they can take Alice," Arthur completed, feeling a bitter taste in his mouth. When he finally arrived home, he found 3 police cars parked in front of the gate. Helen was there next to a man in an expensive suit who must have been her lawyer. She looked different. She was well-dressed, made up, almost unrecognizable from the unhinged woman of days ago. Mary was at the door of the house, hugging Alice, who was crying desperately. "I don't want to go. Please don't let her take me." "Come on, honey," Helen called, her voice strangely sweet. "Mommy misses you. Let's go home." "You don't have a home," Alice shouted, clinging tighter to Mary. "You left us. You always leave." Helen's lawyer approached with the warrant in hand. "Mr. Montgomery, we have a court order. Ms. Martinez has the right to take her daughter." Arthur placed himself between them and the house. "She's scared. You can't just snatch her away like that." Actually, we can, the lawyer replied coldly. And if you continue to obstruct, we will have to request your arrest for contempt. At that moment, Dr. Richards arrived, accompanied by Susan. The social worker immediately began to argue with the court officers, explaining the delicate situation of the children. We need to at least make an adequate transition, she insisted. The psychological trauma of a forced separation can be devastating. The only trauma is this man having kidnapped my children, Helen interrupted, her mask of docility beginning to fall. He has no right to them. He saved Tommy, Alice shouted from the door. He saved my brother when you didn't even know where we were. Shut up! Helen took a step towards the house, but was restrained by the police officers. For a moment, everyone saw a glimpse of the unhinged woman she really was. Arthur seized that moment. Did you see? Did you see how she treats the children? Is this what you want? To return a child to someone like that? The older court officer seemed to hesitate. He consulted the papers in his hands again. Ms. Martinez, he said cautiously, perhaps it's best if we give the girl some time to calm down. We can reschedule for tomorrow. No, Helen stepped forward again. I want my daughter now. You have no right to stop me. It was then that a new voice was heard. Carol had arrived. I have something to say, she announced, walking to the center of the group. I am a witness to Mr. Montgomery's character, and I am also a witness to how malicious people can destroy a child's life. Everyone turned to her. Carol continued, 30 years ago, I saw signs that a child was in danger and did nothing. That child was Mr. Montgomery's younger brother, and he disappeared, just as almost happened to little Tommy. Helen laughed mockingly. And what does that have to do with my children? It has everything to do with it, Carol replied firmly. Because Mr. Montgomery did not kidnap your children. He saved them. He saved Tommy from a fate that could have been the same as his brother's. And now he is trying to save these children from a life of neglect and abuse. Susan seized the moment. We have detailed reports from the last few years, she said, showing a thick folder. Multiple cases of abandonment, reports of neglect, hospitalizations for overdose. Ms. Martinez is not fit to care for these children. The court officer took the folder, starting to browse the documents. Helen, seeing that she was losing control of the situation, changed her tactics. Okay, she said, forcing a smile. It doesn't have to be today, but I want to see my son too. Where's Tommy? At the hospital, Arthur replied dryly. Recovering after someone tried to kidnap him while you were drugged somewhere. Helen's smile faltered. That's not true, you're making it all up. We have the medical reports, Susan interjected. Photos of the rope marks on his wrists, toxicology tests showing the drugs used to dope him. Helen turned to her lawyer, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Do something. Isn't that what I'm paying you for? The lawyer cleared his throat. Ms. Martinez, I think it's best if we retreat for now. There are new elements that we need to evaluate. No. Helen advanced towards the house. Alice, come here right now. I'm your mother. You have to obey me. It was then that something unexpected happened. Alice came out from behind Mary and took a step forward. Although she was still trembling, her voice was firm. You're not my mother. Real mothers don't abandon their children. They don't let them starve. They don't disappear for days without saying where they are. She paused, tears running down her face. Arthur has been more of a father to us in a few days than you have been our whole lives. The silence that followed was deafening. Helen stood there, open-mouthed, as everyone processed the girl's words. It was the court officer who finally broke the silence. I am suspending the execution of this order, he said, putting away the papers. There are serious issues that need to be further evaluated. For now, the girl stays where she is. You can't do this, Helen shouted, all her false composure crumbling. "You'll see! I'll tell everything! I'll destroy you, Montgomery! You and those ungrateful children!" As the police officers tried to calm Helen, who was now shouting and struggling, Alice ran to Arthur and hugged him tightly. "You won't let her take me, will you?" the girl whispered against his chest. "Promise?" Arthur hugged her back, his eyes meeting Carol's over the girl's head. At that moment, he felt as if his brother Michael was there, giving him strength. "I promise," he replied. "No one will ever hurt you or your brother again." The rest of that day passed like a blur. After, Helen was finally taken away by the police. Still shouting threats, the house plunged into a heavy silence. Alice didn't leave Arthur's side, following him around the house like a little shadow. Mary prepared a calming tea for everyone, while Susan and the lawyers remained to discuss the next steps. Carol also stayed, sitting quietly in a corner of the room, watching everything with attentive eyes. "We need to act fast," said Dr. Richards, spreading documents on the coffee table. "Helen is clearly unstable, but she has resources now. Someone is funding this legal battle." "But who?" Arthur asked, running his hand through his already disheveled hair. "And why?" Susan cleared her throat, looking uncomfortable. "We found something," she said, exchanging a glance with the lawyers. "Helen has been making regular visits to someone in prison." Arthur felt Alice squeeze his hand tighter. "Who?" "The man who tried to kidnap Tommy." A shocked silence fell over the room. It was Carol who first found voice. "Are you suggesting that she was involved in the attempted kidnapping of her own son?" Susan nodded gravely. "The visits started before the incident, and there are records of deposits into her bank account, small but regular amounts, coming from a shell corporation." Arthur felt his blood run cold. She sold her own son." "We need concrete evidence before making any accusations," Dr. Richards interjected. "But this would explain why she is fighting so hard for custody now. If she gets the children back, she can finish what she started," Arthur completed, feeling nauseous. Alice, who had remained silent until then, spoke in a small but clear voice. "She always did that. She left us with strangers, received money, then came back to get us when the money ran out." All the adults in the room turned to her, horrified. "Why didn't you ever tell us this before, honey?" Susan asked gently. "Because she said that if we told, they would separate me and Tommy, that I would never be able to see my brother again." Alice buried her face in Arthur's arm. "I don't want to go back to her. Please, don't let her take us." Arthur hugged her, protectively, feeling a fierce determination grow inside him. "I won't let her, never again." "This changes everything," said Dr. Richards, already taking notes. "With this information, we can ask not only for definitive custody, but for the opening of a criminal investigation. But we need to act cautiously," Susan warned. "Helen is cornered, and people like that are more dangerous. We need to ensure the children's safety first." At that moment, Arthur's phone rang. It was from the hospital. Tommy was asking for his sister, agitated after seeing news about Helen on the television in his room. "I need to take Alice to see her brother," Arthur said, standing up. "He needs to know that everything is okay." "I'll go with you," Carol offered, "if you don't mind." On the way to the hospital, Carol told Alice about Michael, about how he was brave and protective with the younger children at school, just as Alice was with Tommy. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes bad things happen, but that doesn't mean we're to blame. Your Arthur carried a guilt that wasn't his for too long." Alice, from the back seat, looked at Arthur in the rearview mirror. "Like me and Tommy, we always thought it was our fault Mom didn't like us." Arthur felt his heart tighten. "It was never your fault," he said firmly. Some people don't know how to love right. At the hospital, they found Tommy awake and anxious. As soon as he saw his sister, he gave a smile that lit up his whole tired face. "Alice, you didn't leave!" "Of course not, silly," she replied, running to hug him. "I promised I wouldn't leave you alone, remember?" While the children talked, Arthur watched from the door with Carol. The retired teacher had tears in her eyes. "You know," she said quietly, "I spent 30 years blaming myself for not doing more for Michael, for not insisting when I saw the signs. But seeing you now, how you protect these children," she paused, wiping her eyes, "Michael would be proud of the man you have become." Arthur felt something warm and moist run down his face. It was his own tears, which he had long not allowed to shed. "Sometimes," Carol continued, "life gives us a second chance. Not to fix the past, but to do differently in the future." At that moment, Alice called from the bed, "Arthur, come see. Tommy can already sit up alone." As he walked towards them, Arthur felt as if a huge weight was being lifted from his shoulders. He couldn't change what happened to Michael, but he could ensure that Alice and Tommy had a different future. The moment of peace, however, was interrupted by an alert on his cell phone. It was a news notification. His blood ran cold as he read the headline, "Businesswoman makes serious allegations against millionaire Arthur Montgomery. He is obsessed with missing children," says close source. Tommy, noticing his expression, asked worriedly, "What's wrong?" Arthur forced a smile, quickly putting away his cell phone. "Nothing important. Let's focus on what really matters. You're getting better, and you'll be able to go home soon." But while the children went back to talking animatedly, his mind was working a mile a minute. Helen wasn't acting alone. Someone was helping her. Someone with enough resources and influence to manipulate the media. The question was, who could hate Arthur Montgomery so much that they would use 2 innocent children in their revenge? The answer, he would soon discover, was closer than he imagined. And when the truth came to light, it would change everything he thought he knew about his brother's disappearance. Back at the mansion that night, Arthur couldn't sleep. The malicious headline kept hammering in his mind, along with the growing certainty that there was something bigger behind it all. He decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He went to the basement, where he kept old boxes with family documents. Among the dust and cobwebs, he found what he was looking for. A box marked Michael Case. Inside were all the newspaper clippings from that time, police reports, notes from private detectives that his parents had hired. He sat on the dusty floor and began to reread everything, this time with adult eyes. Something caught his attention. In the police reports, there was mention of a witness who saw Michael get into a dark car. The witness was identified only as J.R. "J.R.," Arthur murmured to himself. Why did those initials seem important? It was then that he heard a noise, coming from upstairs. Light steps, almost hesitant. He ran up the stairs quickly, worried that Alice was having another nightmare. He found the girl in the hallway, standing in front of his office. "I couldn't sleep," she said, hugging her new teddy bear. "I had a bad dream. Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. Alice nodded, so Arthur led her to the kitchen. While he prepared hot chocolate for the two of them, something his mother used to do when he had nightmares after Michael's disappearance, the girl began to speak. "I dreamed about the day the bad man took Tommy," she said in a low voice. "But this time it was different. Mom was there too, laughing." Arthur sat next to her, placing the steaming mug in front of her. "It was just a dream, Alice. You're safe now. But there's something I never told you," she continued, staring at the chocolate. "On the day Tommy disappeared, I saw Mom talking to the bad man before. They were at the bar near our house." Arthur felt his heart race. "Are you sure?" "I am. She was taking money from him. Then she left and left us alone, as she always did. Only this time..." Her voice trailed off. "This time the man came back to get Tommy." Arthur completed, feeling a wave of nausea. Alice nodded, tears running silently down her face. I should have told you before, but Mom always said that no one would believe us anyway. Arthur hugged her tight, feeling her small body tremble. You're being very brave in telling me this now. It will help us protect you and your brother. At that moment, his cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Susan. We discovered something important about Helen. We need to talk urgently. I'll have to leave early tomorrow, he said to Alice, but Mary will stay with you, and I've increased the security of the house. Nothing is going to happen. The girl squeezed her bear tighter. Promise you'll be back soon? I promise. The next morning, after making sure Alice was safe with Mary, Arthur drove to Susan's office. The social worker was waiting for him with a grave expression. What did you find out? He asked as soon as he entered. Susan opened a folder on her computer. We were investigating Helen's visits to Tommy's kidnapper. We discovered that she had known him for years. In fact, he was an old associate of hers. What do you mean? Apparently, Helen was part of a larger scheme. She identified vulnerable children that no one would miss, and handed them over to this man. Arthur felt the blood freeze in his veins. And what did he do with these children? We don't know for sure yet. But there are records of significant bank transfers, all coming from a company called JR Enterprises. Arthur almost dropped the cup of coffee he was holding. JR, are you sure? Susan looked at him curiously. Yes. Why? With trembling hands, Arthur took out one of the old police reports about Michael from his pocket. Look at this. The only witness to my brother's disappearance was identified as JR. At the time, the police were never able to locate this person for a full statement. Susan took the document, her eyes widening as she read. That was 30 years ago. Do you think there could be a connection? I don't know, Arthur replied honestly. But it's too much of a coincidence. At that moment, Susan's phone rang. She answered, her expression quickly changing from worry to alarm. What? When? She made some quick notes. We're on our way. What happened? Arthur asked, already sensing that something was terribly wrong. Helen escaped from the rehab clinic again, and this time she took Tommy. Arthur felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. What do you mean? He was in the hospital. There was security. She managed to get in posing as a nurse. She took advantage of the change of shifts. When the real nurse arrived to administer the medication, the room was empty. Arthur was already running for the door. We need to alert the police. Set up roadblocks. They're already doing that, Susan said, running after him. But there's one more thing. Before fleeing with Tommy, Helen left an envelope for you at the hospital. In the car, with trembling hands, Arthur opened the envelope. Inside, there was only a piece of paper with a typed message. Now you know what it's like to lose a brother. If you want to see Tommy again, come alone to the same place where Michael disappeared. You have 1 hour, and don't worry about Alice. We'll be picking her up soon too. Signed, JR. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. After 30 years, he was finally about to discover the truth about his brother's disappearance. But the price could be too high. The lives of 2 innocent children were at stake. Where are you going? Asked Susan, seeing him make a sharp turn. To the place where it all began, he replied, his voice filled with a dark determination. The old school where Michael disappeared. The old school had been abandoned for years, its once colorful walls now peeling and covered in graffiti. Arthur parked the car in front of the rusty gate, his heart beating so hard it felt like it wanted to jump out of his chest. You can't go alone, Susan insisted for the 3rd time. It's an obvious trap. I have no choice, he replied, checking the messages on his cell phone. Mary had confirmed that Alice remained safe at home, protected by security guards. "If I don't go, they'll hurt Tommy, and then they'll go after Alice. Then let me call for backup. We can—" "No!" Arthur interrupted her sharply. "I can't risk it. I already lost one brother here. I'm not going to lose anyone else." Before Susan could protest again, he got out of the car. The schoolyard, where he had so often played with Michael, was covered in tall grass and rubble. Each step made his heart clench with painful memories. It was then that he heard a faint voice coming from inside the building. "Arthur?" "Tommy?" he called, running towards the sound. "Here!" The boy's voice was stronger now. "In the gym!" Arthur walked through dark corridors, guiding himself by memory and by Tommy's voice. The gym was in the back of the school. It was there that he was when Michael disappeared, playing ball with friends while he should have been taking care of his brother. The double doors of the gym were ajar. Inside, the dim light that entered through the dirty windows revealed a scene that made his blood run cold. Tommy was sitting in a chair in the center of the court, apparently unharmed but visibly frightened. Helen was next to him, a hand on his shoulder, and there was someone else, an elderly man in a wheelchair, partially hidden in the shadows. "Welcome, Arthur," said the man, his voice hoarse but firm. "Or should I say, welcome back." Arthur took a step forward, trying to keep his voice calm despite the fear. "Who are you?" The man moved his chair into the light. His face was marked by old scars, and one side seemed partially paralyzed. But his eyes were alive and filled with an ancient hatred. "Don't you recognize me? Of course not. Time hasn't been kind to me. But you must remember my name, Joseph Richards, or how I signed on the police reports, J.R. Arthur felt his legs weaken. You were the school janitor." "Very good," Joseph Richards applauded sarcastically. "I was the janitor, the invisible man that nobody noticed, who cleaned up the mess of rich and spoiled children like you and your brother." "What do you want?" Arthur asked, his eyes fixed on Tommy, who was trembling visibly. "I want you to feel what I felt." The man's voice rose, filled with bitterness. "When your father destroyed my life, when he took everything from me." Arthur frowned, confused. "My father? What are you talking about?" Joseph Richards laughed, a harsh and humorless sound. "Your father was a lawyer for the company where I worked before becoming a janitor. When I discovered a fraud scheme, I tried to report it, but your father buried the evidence, sued me for slander. I lost my job, my reputation, everything." "And that's why you took my brother?" Arthur's voice trembled with anger. "No," Helen interjected suddenly. "Tell the truth, Dad. Tell everything." Arthur felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "Dad." Joseph Richards smiled bitterly. "Yes, Helen is my daughter. After I lost everything, I could no longer support her. She grew up in orphanages, on the streets, all because of your family. So this is revenge after 30 years. Revenge is a dish best served cold," replied the old man, his eyes shining with a sickly light. "When I saw you that day, all important in your expensive suit, saving that kid, I knew it was my chance. Helen had been in the scheme for years, identifying children for me. It was easy to convince her to use her own children as bait." "You're sick," Arthur said, taking another step towards Tommy. "Using innocent children." "Innocent?" Joseph Richards laughed again. "Like you were innocent when you left your brother alone. Like I was innocent when I tried to do the right thing. There is no innocence in this world, Arthur, just consequences." What happened to Michael? The question that had tormented Arthur for 30 years finally came out. The old man leaned forward in his wheelchair. "Do you really want to know? He was scared, calling for you." "Arthur, Arthur." He shouted as I took him away. "But you were too busy playing ball to hear. Arthur felt warm tears streaming down his face. "Where is he? What did you do with him?" "Dead," Joseph Richards replied coldly. "An accident, actually. He tried to run away, slipped, hit his head. It wasn't what I planned. I just wanted to keep him hidden for a while, make your family suffer. But accidents happen." "You monster!" Arthur lunged forward, but Helen quickly pulled Tommy closer. "Aha," Joseph Richards warned. "One more step and this one has the same fate, and then we'll go get his little sister." "Why?" asked Arthur, his voice broken. "Why continue with this after so long?" "Because the pain never went away," shouted the old man, pounding on the arm of his chair. "All these years seeing you grow up, succeed, while my daughter lived on the streets, and now you want to take her grandchildren away too?" "She abandoned these children," Arthur replied. "Left them, starving, sold her own son. I had no choice." Helen finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Dad said it was the only way, that we needed the money." "There is always a choice," Arthur said, looking directly at her. "You chose drugs instead of your children. You chose revenge instead of love." Something in Arthur's words seemed to hit Helen. She looked at Tommy, who was crying silently, and then at her father in the wheelchair. "He's right, Dad," she said softly. "This has to end." Joseph Richards turned sharply to his daughter. "What? No, not after all this time, all the planning." "Enough!" Helen released Tommy's arm. "I've hurt my children enough. I'm not going to let you use them like you used me." Tommy, as soon as he was free, ran to Arthur, who hugged him protectively. "You weakling!" shouted Joseph Richards, trying to move his wheelchair. "After everything we've done." "What we've done is wrong," Helen replied, tears running down her face. "Michael was just a child, like Tommy and Alice are now, and she sobbed. "I became just like you." At that moment, they heard sirens in the distance. Susan must have called for backup, despite Arthur's instructions. "Go," Helen said suddenly. "Take Tommy. I'll take care of my dad." Arthur hesitated for only a second before picking up Tommy in his arms and running out of the gym. Behind them, they could hear Joseph Richards' furious screams and Helen's sobs. When they reached the courtyard, police cars already surrounded the school. Susan ran to them. "Thank God!" she exclaimed, quickly checking if Tommy was okay. "I couldn't let you face this alone." Arthur just nodded, still holding Tommy tightly. The boy was trembling, but he was safe. "We need to go," he said. "Alice is waiting." The trip back home was silent. Tommy had fallen asleep in the back seat, exhausted physically and emotionally. Arthur drove carefully, often looking in the rearview mirror to make sure the boy was okay. Susan had stayed at the school to oversee the arrest of Joseph Richards and Helen. When they arrived at the mansion, Alice was waiting at the door, against all of Mary's recommendations to stay inside. As soon as she saw her brother, she ran to the car. "Tommy!" she shouted, opening the car door before Arthur could even park completely. The boy woke up startled, but seeing his sister, he gave a tired smile. "Hi, Alice." The two hugged tightly, as if they never wanted to let go again. Arthur and Mary watched the scene, both with tears in their eyes. "Let's go inside," Arthur said softly. "You need to rest." Inside the house, Mary had already prepared hot chocolate and cookies, always believing that sweets helped heal emotional wounds. The children settled on the living room couch, still clinging to each other. "Mum, she's not coming back, is she?" Alice asked hesitantly. Arthur sat in front of them, choosing his words carefully. "No, she and your grandfather did very wrong things. They will have to answer for that." "She seemed different in the end," Tommy said quietly, "like she was sorry." "Sometimes," Arthur replied, "people do bad things because they have also been hurt. But that doesn't make their actions right." "Like you?" asked Alice, surprising him. "You were sad and alone because of your brother. But you didn't become bad like them. Arthur felt his heart tighten. It's different, Alice. I closed. Myself off to the world, I hid behind work. It wasn't a healthy way to deal with the pain, but now you have us, she completed with a small smile. At that moment, the phone rang. It was Susan, with news. Joseph Richards and Helen were in custody. During the initial interrogation, Helen had confirmed everything. The involvement with Michael's disappearance, the child trafficking scheme, the attempt to use her own children as part of her revenge. She's cooperating, Susan said. I think she finally realized the harm she caused. She is providing information about other children who may be in danger. And Joseph Richards refused to speak. But with Helen's testimony and the evidence we found on his computer, he won't escape this time. After hanging up, Arthur found the children dozing on the couch. Tommy had rested his head on his sister's shoulder, and Alice hugged him protectively. The scene reminded him of how he used to protect Michael. Mary appeared silently with blankets. Do you want me to take them to their rooms? Arthur shook his head. Leave them here. I think they need to stay together today. Later, when the house was silent and the children were sleeping soundly in their beds, Arthur went to his office. The envelope with the old news stories about Michael was still on the desk. But now, for the first time in 30 years, he felt he could look at those headlines without being consumed by guilt. He picked up the drawing that Carol had given him, the two boys holding hands, the word protector written in childish handwriting. Next to it, he placed a recent photo of Tommy and Alice, taken days before at the hospital. The parallel was striking, the same look of admiration, the same unconditional love between siblings. The phone rang again. It was Carol. How are they? She asked, the concern evident in her voice. Shaken but safe, Arthur replied. They'll need a lot of support, a lot of therapy, but I think they'll be okay. And you? How are you? Arthur thought for a moment before answering. You know, for 30 years I carried the guilt for Michael's death. I thought that if I had been more attentive, more responsible. But it wasn't your fault, Carol interrupted softly. No, he agreed. It wasn't. And today, I was able to do what I couldn't do for Michael. I was able to protect two children who needed help. Michael would be proud, said Carol, and those children are lucky to have you. After hanging up, Arthur stood looking out the office window. The night was clear, with thousands of stars shining in the sky. Somewhere up there, he thought, Michael must be smiling. A soft noise made him turn around. Alice was standing at the office door, hugging her teddy bear. Can't sleep? He asked, gently. She shook her head. I had a dream about Michael. Arthur felt his heart skip a beat. Really? What kind of dream? He was smiling, she said, entering the office. He said he was happy because now you're not alone anymore. Arthur felt tears forming in his eyes. He opened his arms, and Alice ran into his hug. You know, she said, her voice muffled against his chest, I think he sent us to you, so you wouldn't be sad. Arthur hugged her tighter, letting the tears flow freely. Maybe you're right, little one. Maybe you're right. At that moment, embraced by the girl who had changed his life, Arthur knew he was finally at peace. The circle of pain and loneliness that began with the loss of Michael was closing, not with more tragedy, but with love and hope. Life had given him a second chance, not to fix the past, but to create a different future, a future where two children who knew only abandonment and fear could finally have a real home. 6 months had passed since that night at the abandoned school. The Montgomery mansion, once silent and cold, now overflowed with life and joy. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls, and even Mary, always so serious, was often seen smiling as she prepared elaborate snacks for her two new favorite children. On a sunny Sunday morning, Arthur watched from the porch while Tommy and Alice played in the garden. The boy had fully recovered, both physically and emotionally. Therapy was helping both children process their traumas, and they were slowly learning to just be kids. "Look, Arthur!" shouted Tommy, proudly showing off a star he had managed to make in gymnastics class. Their extra classes were paying off. The shy and scared boy was turning into a confident and cheerful child. Alice, who practiced ballet twice a week, tried to imitate her brother's movement, but ended up falling on the grass, laughing. Her red hair, once always disheveled, was now tied in an elaborate braid that Mary had learned to do especially for her. Arthur smiled, remembering the final custody hearing, which had taken place the week before. Helen, serving time in a women's prison, had officially renounced all parental rights. In her last statement, she demonstrated genuine regret. "My children deserve to be happy," she had told the judge, "and for the first time in their lives they really are. I won't interfere with that." Joseph Richards, on the other hand, had been sentenced to a long term, not only for his involvement in Michael's disappearance, but also for a series of other crimes discovered during the investigation. His obsession with revenge had destroyed not only his life, but affected dozens of families over the years. The sound of the doorbell brought Arthur back to the present. It was Carol, who now visited them regularly. The retired teacher had become a kind of grandmother to the children, always bringing new books and interesting stories to tell. "Grandma Carol!" shouted Tommy and Alice in unison, running to hug her. Arthur smiled as he heard the children calling her Grandma. It was something that had started spontaneously, and Carol, who never had children of her own, was moved every time she heard it. "I brought a surprise," she said, after distributing kisses and hugs. From her bag, she took out an old photo album. "I found this while tidying up my attic." They were photos from the time she was a teacher at the school, including several of Michael. In one of them, the two brothers were sitting on the school stairs, smiling, sharing a snack. "Can I see?" asked Alice, sitting next to Arthur on the couch. Tommy settled on the other side, both looking curiously at the old photos. "Was this Michael?" asked Tommy, pointing to a boy with dark hair and a wide smile. "He looked like you, Arthur." "Yes," Arthur replied, his voice soft. "He was very special, like you." "You know," said Alice thoughtfully, "sometimes I feel like he's here, like a guardian angel watching over us." Arthur hugged them both tighter, feeling his heart fill with love. It was amazing how two children who had known so much pain could have so much wisdom and sensitivity. Mary appeared with a tray of hot chocolate and cookies, now a Sunday tradition in the house. As they served themselves, Susan arrived for her weekly follow-up visit. "I have news," she announced, accepting a cup of chocolate. "The judge has set the date for the final adoption. In 2 weeks, you will officially be a family." Alice jumped off the couch, dropping cookies everywhere. "Really? We'll be able to have Arthur's last name?" "Yes," confirmed Susan, smiling. "You will officially be Tommy and Alice Montgomery." Tommy, normally more restrained than his sister, also couldn't contain his joy. "Does that mean you're going to be our real dad?" Arthur felt his heart swell with emotion. "I'm already your dad in my heart," he said. "The paper will only make official what we already know." That night, after the children had finally gone to sleep, Arthur spent some time in his office. On the wall, he had had a mural made with photos, old and new. Michael was there, smiling in his childhood photos. Next to him, recent photos of Tommy and Alice, the first day of school, ballet and gymnastics performances, birthdays, everyday moments. In the center of the mural, he had placed the drawing that Michael had made, the two brothers holding hands. And next to it, a new drawing made by Alice, 5 people holding hands with the words, "My family." She, Tommy, Arthur, and 2 angels in the sky that she explained were Michael and their grandmother. Mary entered silently with a cup of tea. The children slept well, she informed him. Tommy said he wants to make pancakes for breakfast tomorrow. Arthur smiled. It was amazing how his life had changed. Before, his days were filled only with work and loneliness. Now they were filled with small joys: breakfast with pancakes, helping with homework, watching ballet and gymnastics performances, telling stories before bed. "You know, Mary," he said, observing the photos on the mural, "for 30 years I lived blaming myself for what happened to Michael. I built walls around me. I convinced myself that I didn't deserve to be happy." Mary nodded, understandingly. She had witnessed his years of isolation and pain. "But now I understand," he continued. "Michael would never want that for me. He would want me to be happy, to help other children like I couldn't help him. And that's exactly what you did," Mary said softly. "You gave a home and love to 2 children who desperately needed both." At that moment, they heard a noise coming. From the hallway. It was Alice, again having trouble sleeping. "Did you have another nightmare?" Arthur asked gently. She shook her head. "No, it's just that I was thinking, when we change our names, we're going to be a real family, right?" Arthur picked her up in his arms, feeling her small body snuggle against his chest. "We're already a real family, little one. The paper will only confirm that to the rest of the world. So you promise you'll never leave us, that you'll be our dad forever?" "I promise," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "Forever and ever." As he carried her back to bed, Arthur felt a deep peace in his heart. The circle was complete. The pain had turned into love, the loneliness into family, the fear into hope. Somewhere, he was sure, Michael was smiling, satisfied to see that his older brother had finally found his way back to happiness. And this time, Arthur knew, nothing and no one could take that away from him. Because true love, the kind that is born from the most improbable circumstances and survives the greatest storms, is the kind of love that lasts forever. And forever was exactly the time he planned to love and protect Tommy and Alice, his children, his miracle, his redemption,